Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this Engaging the Mind program. My name is Susan Lynch. I am the Associate Director of Lifetime Learning at the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. I'm so pleased that you are joining us this afternoon. Before starting the program, I'd like to bring a few things to your attention. If you have a question during the presentation, you may enter it in the webinar Q&A at the bottom of the screen. You'll find resources in the webinar chat box. Please also note this program is being recorded and will be posted in Lifetime Learning's podcast library in about a week or two. Now on to our speaker. Aynne Kokas is the C.K. Yen Professor at the Miller Center, Director of the University of Virginia's East Asia Center, and an Associate Professor of Media Studies at the University of Virginia. A Fulbright Scholar educated at the University of Michigan with a PhD from UCLA, Kokas is a fellow in the Public Intellectuals Program of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. She's the author of Hollywood Made in China, a study of the partnerships between Chinese and American producers to produce feature films for global audiences. Her latest book, Trafficking Data, How China is Winning the Battle for Digital Sovereignty, is what we are here to discuss today. Her research has been supported by the Library of Congress, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mellon Foundation, and the Social Science Research Council. So thank you again for joining us for this Lifetime Learning program. Now I'll turn the program over to Professor Kokas. And Professor Kokas, I invite you to start your presentation.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that wonderful introduction. And I'd like to thank UVA Lifetime Learning, the Office of Engagement, Althea Brooks, Ashley Gresh, Dana Mays. And I'd also like to take a moment to thank the UVA community for helping this book actually become a reality. First of all, I'd like to thank my terrific research assistants, many of whom are UVA undergraduates, including Emily Hamilton, who I think actually might be on the call today. I'd also like to thank the Miller Center for Public Affairs, the East Asia Center, and the Media Studies Department at UVA for creating such a hospitable environment for doing research. Without this amazing infrastructure that we have here at UVA, it would have been impossible for me to write this book. And also, as an aside, I also am deeply grateful to the UVA alumni community because it was really instrumental in the types of policy-driven research that I was able to do here. So to just share a quick story, when I first started doing research on this book, I was attending a variety of different policy seminars in DC as part of my research process. And I asked a question at one of these seminars, and I identified myself as a UVA professor. And one of the people who was speaking at the event was a UVA alum. After the event, and I was still relatively new at UVA, after the event, he came up to me and yelled, "Wahoo-wah!" And I didn't even know what to do or what to say. But he was so enthusiastic about this UVA connection and actually was extremely helpful in terms of introducing me to other policymakers I could speak to, offered a lot of really helpful insights. And as I was going through the process of working on the book, what I found was that the UVA alumni community was remarkably supportive and remarkably helpful when trying to do research in this area. So I just wanted to be sure to thank the people on this call for your support of the university and to thank you for being such an amazing community that makes it so exciting and so interesting for people like me to do research here. So with that, I'm excited to share my research with you. So just as an aside, if anyone would like to get in touch with me, I am available on social media at Aynne Kokas or via email at ak3ff@virginia.edu. Now, to begin with, I'd like to give you a little overview of what I'll be talking about today. And one of the things that I've found with my students is that it's helpful to tell people what you're going to tell them at the beginning, and then I'll tell you also at the end. But just in case some of you drop off, or in case you want to get the main thrust of what we're talking about today, our key point here is that US regulatory fragmentation, Silicon Valley's data lust, and Wall Street's addiction to growth have fueled the expansion of the Chinese government's digital realm. So what this ultimately means is that a lot of the features of the US system, specifically an open regulatory environment for the development of the tech sector, a tech sector that's able to process large amounts of user data and develop increasingly new and advanced technologies, as well as a very enriching and very powerful system of capital markets operating in the US, has allowed China and Chinese firms to grow within a US context, relatively unchecked in terms of the type of data that Chinese firms can gather. And it's actually less about what data the firms can gather, because truthfully, a lot of Chinese firms operating in the US are not necessarily more predatory of user data than US-based firms, but it's the type of levers of pressure that the Chinese government is able to put onto those companies that makes the situation fundamentally different. So what we see is that the combination of user data, corporate data, and government data is establishing a span of control globally right now. And whereas in a US context, there's a huge amount of skepticism surrounding the use of surrounding government use of data, and often with very good reason, what we're seeing in other contexts, and especially within a Chinese context, is that there are many levers that governments can use to gather and deploy and synthesize data from corporations that are not just gathering data domestically, but also globally. The other part that's particularly challenging in this context is that it's not just about what data is being gathered now, but also about the pathways that governments like the Chinese government are able to establish to grow data globally in a context like in the US, where we see very limited national oversight. So it's very difficult to actually map or understand how much user data is being gathered, even though we know that from a Chinese government perspective, there is increasingly an effort to expand the scope of government capacity to pressure private firms to share user data. Now, as we're talking about this, I think we also need to discuss this challenge of talking about China. And we're in a very, very tense environment within a US-China context, one that was not aided by the defense minister going missing this past week. What we see is an environment where there's increasingly bellicose rhetoric on both sides about Taiwan and about the Taiwan Straits. We're also seeing China taking an increasingly aggressive role in a US or in a global context, as well as the US arming itself more in response to China. So these are really significant concerns, but also they exist within an environment where if we don't talk about specific issues with a critical eye and with a narrow perspective, so rather than talking about China broadly, we talk specifically about the Chinese government or Xi Jinping as a leader. Just this kind of broad anti-China rhetoric can inflame racial dynamics within a US context and build on this idea of China as a threatening other. And one of the things that I really want to emphasize at the beginning of this presentation is that the people who provided me with some of the most nuanced and helpful insight in this book were people who also were people who were working for Chinese companies, people who were working at lower levels of the Chinese government, who are also concerned about some of these phenomena. And so I think when we talk about China broadly, it's really important to think about specific laws and policies that are being enacted by the Chinese government, rather than China as an entity that includes all the Chinese people, or often what we're seeing is an increasingly anti-immigrant rhetoric in the US and an increasingly challenging environment specifically for Chinese immigrants in universities like UVA. And these are issues that I think we really need to contend with in a very nuanced way. Within the book, I look at this idea of gridlock that was introduced by the scholar Pardis Madhavi, who does really interesting work on the rights of Iranian women and how we can talk about the rights of Iranian women. But she does so within a US context, where often that her discussions of nuanced rights of Iranian women's rights become entwined with anti-Iranian sentiment in the US and Orientalism within a US context. And so when we're talking about these issues in a US-China context, I want to always first step back and say, when I'm referring to China in this context, I'm talking about the specific laws and policies enacted by the Chinese government. And that when we're thinking about the ways in which these laws and policies are enacted, it's important to think about the fact that Chinese companies are facing, if not as much of a challenge, if not more of a challenge, as companies that are operating within a US context are facing. So these are really tough issues, and they're not easy answers. So just as we're going through this, I know a lot of people just want to know what, should we ban TikTok? Should we not ban TikTok? What do we do here? It often comes down to really, really careful, narrow calculations. So I just want to emphasize that here. Now, the animating concept of my book is this idea of data trafficking, which is the extractive process that exploits corporate data to share with third parties with limited acknowledgement or consent to gain government control. So when we're thinking about this, the kind of most obvious case that we can think about is the case of TikTok, where it's a firm that has a Chinese parent company, where we've seen that there's a kind of fluidity in terms of its data sharing policy with its parent company, and then its parent company, ByteDance, faces a huge amount of pressure to share user data with the Chinese government. The big challenge we also see here is one of US regulation, where because of the way that data in the US is regulated, which is very little and often not at all, it's also very difficult to track the degree to which these data exchanges or this data trafficking is occurring between companies that operate in the US, their Chinese parent companies, and the Chinese government. But what we see is already a non-consensual leakage of user data across borders, as well as increasing pressure from a variety of different laws and policies implemented by the Chinese government to pressure companies like TikTok to share user data across borders. Now, when we're thinking about data, it's also important to think about what this means and how we can consider it. Now, we can think about data in a lot of different ways, technically, but I think it's also important to think about it metaphorically when we're looking at how these practices evolve. So in the early 2000s, there was this idea that data was the new oil, a sort of extractive process, something that would be extracted from people, from organizations, from entities, from platforms. And we see that to some degree, but increasingly it has evolved into something that also functions as a sort of infrastructure. So if we look at something like GPT-4, it relies on a wide range of user data to create new infrastructures of artificial intelligence. And this is actually something in my previous life, or in my previous book, when I was writing Hollywood Made in China, I did a lot of research in LA and in the entertainment industry. And one of the things that's currently a feature of the WGA strikes, the Writers Guild strikes, and the SAG, or the Screen Actors Guild strikes, is this idea that studios want to use existing writing and existing people as data that creates a new infrastructure of creativity, where existing scripts or existing writing gets fed into creating new scripts and new writing, but that it creates a sort of new infrastructure for writing and maybe creativity. That's a whole significant debate. Or the images of specific actors or a wide range of actors can then be fed into AI and to create new images that can then populate the entertainment industry. So it's no longer just something that's being extracted. It's also something that's being deployed as part of building new infrastructures in a variety of different industries. And I use the entertainment industry because that's where my previous research was, but this exists in a healthcare context. We're also in a manufacturing context, and I'm happy to talk about what that looks like in a variety of different places. The other way it's important to think about data, and where a lot of companies are thinking about data, is thinking of it as an asset. And we're not just talking about an asset very abstractly, but actually as a financial asset that companies can leverage in order to get actual capital. So one of the things that was one of the most shocking findings of doing research on this book was that companies in bankruptcy can actually be forced to sell their user data as one of their assets. And so when you are making an agreement in the terms of service with a company, you are not just agreeing to what that company may ultimately do, or what the random third parties that are still in that terms of service might agree to do with your data, you are also making a bet that that company does not go under, and that you are not making a bet about what happens to your data with their creditors or with the bank that is selling off their data to data brokers in a US context or global context, who can really sell their data to almost anyone. And that's a whole nother really interesting kettle of fish to think about within particularly a US context. So when we're thinking about what data is, there are a variety of different ways we can think about this that help to shape our understanding of what it does and why it's important. The other thing, and one of the reasons why I use the word trafficking in the book, is to think about this question of a sort of violation and a sort of lawlessness that can occur when companies use data without really clear user consent, and how this becomes a sort of violation of our personal lives, of our interpersonal communication, of intimate spaces. So, for example, one of the cases that or a couple of the cases that I talk about within the book are the LGBTQ dating and networking site, LGBTQ plus dating and networking site Grindr, where user data, including voice and video and HIV status, really personal information about people, was shared not just on the platform itself, but was sold to a Chinese firm based in Beijing, and then was accessible and held on Chinese government-run servers, or Chinese government servers, Chinese servers to which the government had access. So all of these terms are really interesting and complicated because of the ways in which the Chinese government and the Chinese data center industry and Chinese firms are all closely entwined. So that's one of the significant challenges that we have as analysts based in a US context, because the lines between what constitutes government tech and private sector tech are actually substantially more clear within a US context because of the financial interests of the tech sector and their ability to build firewalls with the US government because of their financial power in the US sector. So when we think about this idea of trafficking, we can think about trafficking in a couple of different ways. And this word trafficking becomes important in a couple of different ways. So one is this idea of drug trafficking. So if we think about something that's highly addictive, that relies on users, and that creates a kind of system of exploitation and addiction that undermines national borders because of these demands of users. We're already kind of seeing that happen in a US context. And I don't know if any of you saw the extremely tearful entreaties of TikTok influencers when there was the threat of the TikTok ban, that their entire livelihoods would be destroyed, the entreaties of TikTok users who were very concerned that they wouldn't be able to access the app, the challenging situation that the state of Virginia has been in, and UVA has been in when we're thinking about the Virginia government's TikTok and WeChat bans for state networks and devices, when also applied to a student context where we have a lot of students who use UVA networks and use these apps. It's a really interesting and challenging dynamic that is in many ways grounded in how appealing and how addictive these apps and platforms are. We can also think about, when we think about this personal, intimate question of this idea of human trafficking. So when we're looking at something like like SAG being concerned that people are being replicated in people's bodies, people's voices, their abilities, their acting abilities are being replicated by AI. This becomes a question not just about our personal or intimate data, but also about how it can be used in global contexts. Also about how it can create or generate profiles of individuals, predictive behaviors, particularly in election contexts. So we're thinking about really intimate questions about what constitutes our humanity and how people can be manipulated because of knowledge of that. And then finally, we can think about this idea of data traffic. So data traffic is the movement of user data that apps and platforms and a variety of different systems use to build more sophisticated algorithms, to document engagement for the purposes of monetizing their services with advertisers. So when we're thinking about data traffic, this exists at the core of the digital economy. And amplifying traffic amplifies the amount of user data. The more user data that companies have access to, the more they're able to draw people in. And one of the most fascinating aspects of a class that I teach called the Data Ethics of TikTok through the terrific new UVA Engagements curriculum is I talk with my students about their experiences online and how many of them feel in some ways paralyzed when they go online and spend time on the apps, whichever apps they're using. We talk about TikTok, but there are also a variety of other apps and platforms that students use. And one of the most common things that I hear from students is this experience of being online late at night for hours, just kind of frozen in place, watching a variety of different videos being fed to them. And this is where a lot of these questions become really, really murky and really challenging. Because if you look at it within a Chinese context, that's now like for people, especially 18 and under, there are actually regulations in place related to IP addresses for access to both mobile device and IP address access to being able to use social media apps after hours for young people. Which is in some ways a very protective mechanism. Now, obviously, that would never fly in a US context. We only have data protection for people age 13 and under. And really, that's, if you talk to any 13-year-olds or any 10-year-olds you can realize how deeply ineffectual those regulations are. But this idea of data traffic is something that companies, both American companies and Chinese companies, are trying to magnify and amplify as much as possible in order to increase and enrich their firms. And we see that this is in many ways a self-replicating cycle of feedback loops. So it's based on something called network effects, or the idea that the more populous a network is, the greater its value. So we see the more users that it attracts, it expands the user base. There's a better user experience and more retention. How many of you have gotten on an app just because someone else you knew or several other people you knew had told you that you should be on it? Or even if you're not on it, you feel kind of left out because you're not on it and you're not using it. But then this also creates this perception of a superior product offering, then that optimizes ads and recommendations. It attracts third-party data and third-party business and data sharing, and that enhances data collection on existing users. So all of this feeds into a cycle of data trafficking, and this is at the very core of the digital economy in a US context, but also globally. And what we've seen within a US context is this unprecedented growth in the tech sector. And we recently saw these hearings and discussions in the Senate about the future of AI, and some really significant frustration expressed by US senators that they weren't really able to engage with or ask questions of tech leaders who deigned to appear in front of Congress to talk about a lot of these issues. And this really, in many ways, shows the breakdown of a lot of the types of representative government that are important for things like tech regulation. If we don't necessarily see this dialogue between policymakers and tech leaders, but rather kind of a discussion or a focus on self-regulation. And again, in a US-based context, I actually, from my background as a management consultant and from my background working in the automotive and engineered products industries, I see why there would be a strong interest in creating an environment of self-regulation, and how actually in Washington it's very difficult, and a lot of the hearings have demonstrated it's very difficult for people in government to keep up with new developments because of the role of the private sector in the US in developing new technologies. However, one of the significant challenges is that because of that power of the US tech sector, what we're seeing is an environment where there's perhaps over-reliance on self-regulation to the exclusion of an analysis of the kind of global issues that we might see emerging from that. So if we're only looking at the US regulating itself, there are maybe things that the US government or US tech companies might be interested in doing that are very different than if the US is trying to develop a system of data regulation and oversight that takes into account global policies like those that are being developed by the Chinese government. So what we see is that these fragmented data regulations have led to the rise of surveillance capitalism, which has been highly enriching. And frankly, it is, highly enriching to basically anyone who has a stock portfolio in the US context. If you have target date funds, if you use index funds, you have likely been enriched by the system of surveillance capitalism. However, what this also means is that US firms have set a standard for data exploitation with very limited oversight and regulation that has created a dynamic where not only are US firms able to grow from user data that they gather here, but also international firms that may have a very different relationship with their national governments. And this brings us to China's cyber sovereignty policies. Now, when we think about it in a US context, we don't really have any national data security oversight practices. There are protections for specific types of data, like health data. There are protections for people of a specific age, like those under 13. In certain states, there are different types of protections. So, for example, Illinois has a biometric protection policy, biometric data protection policy. In New York, there's more robust financial data protection. But in California, there's the California Consumer Privacy Act. Here in Virginia, we also have statewide data protections, but we don't have a national system. By contrast, within China, what we see is a really robust system of national data oversight. Everything from the cybersecurity law, which requires critical information infrastructure to be stored on Chinese government-run servers and Chinese-based servers. The data security law, which requires national security data oversights of any company that gathers data globally that operates in China, which includes not just Chinese companies. We also see the personal information protection law, which creates the potential for global data oversight of users. The Hong Kong national security law, which creates an extraterritorial oversight for any national security violations that may impact Hong Kong, including use and distribution of user data. And then for a UVA context, one that really struck me was the provisions for online internet governance, which essentially means that if I were to say something here as a producer of knowledge online that violated China's national security, I could be considered to be violating those provisions in online governance, even though I'm not doing it actually in the Chinese context. Now, there are huge problems when we think about how to regulate here. And in many ways, in my book, I talk about how we can think about data problems like climate problems, these really significant challenges where there are huge incentives to continue with the status quo. And there are huge disadvantages to continuing with the status quo. So there are a lot of companies that are being financially enriched. Consumers are getting really significant free products that they're able to use because of the data that they're sharing with companies. We're also in an environment where there's very little oversight over how that user data is being managed, how the products that are emerging from that user data are growing and developing, as we're seeing in debates about AI. We're also seeing that there's very little protection of user data in terms of its transnational flow. Within a climate context, we can see all of these issues where there are really significant financial incentives to continue to persist with existing fossil fuel usage, but there are also obviously really significant problems that we're already seeing emerge with the extremely low levels of Arctic sea ice, hurricanes in Maine, a whole host of other issues that are related to our consumption of fossil fuels. But we see that in both of these cases, there is a huge pressure to maintain the status quo, while also a huge risk of not changing. And so in no way is this something that I see that's easy or that's a clear challenge to resolve. A lot of the efforts to regulate user data are precisely the same things that have driven innovation in the US tech economy, which has been a major driver of growth and financial well-being in a US context. So it's a huge challenge, and it's one that I think we really have to address head on in order to be able to move forward with with emerging technologies that are really challenging everything about the US system of sovereignty, as well as even the most fundamental things about what it means to be human. Now, a lot of these questions emerge as a result of an existing regulatory asymmetry or uneven trading practices between China and the United States. So within a US context, Chinese firms that operate in the US face many different levers through which they're pressured to share user data with their Chinese parent companies, and by extension with the Chinese government. None of those same pressures exist in the opposite direction. So US tech companies, for the most part, particularly social media companies, are very limited in terms of how they can operate in China. They have to store all of their user data in China. So, for example, Tesla operates in China, but all of its user data that comes from its cars all has to be stored in China, in Chinese servers, and can't actually feed back into operations globally. So this is another example of how China's highly centralized and highly expansive regulatory framework creates a disadvantage vis-a-vis the US, where there are very few regulations about data storage, security, or protection. And indeed, there's a really significant conflict of interest. So as we saw with the release of the recent Huawei phone, even in an environment where local competitors have a huge advantage, and indeed that huge advantage and pressure on firms like Apple to share their user data or share their data and to share their IP has led to really robust local competitors emerging in the market. Apple still hasn't pulled out of China because it's still very financially enriching to be there. So there's a real ambivalence by a lot of US tech firms about operating within the Chinese government or within the Chinese market. Now, again, that ambivalence is starting to shift as we're seeing the tightening and the increasing challenges in the context of US-China relations, more difficult business environments that are emerging with increase in Chinese regulations. But it still remains that US firms, particularly big US tech firms that are making a lot of money in China, that are doing things like creating devices rather than operating in the social media sector, are particularly vulnerable to external Chinese government pressures because of their continued interest in the market. What we also see is that because of these pressures, trade with China amplifies illiberalism in the US tech sector, meaning amplifies that lack of transparency we see in the US tech sector. And one of the things that really strikes me is, and I think the case of Apple is a great one to think about here. In 2017, Apple moved all of its iCloud user data to Chinese servers in China in response to the cybersecurity law. And these servers are ostensibly accessible by government officials. It included iCloud data from Chinese users, but there were also reports that it included data from any users that were in China. Now, that same company in 2019, in a US context, put a billboard up, and this is actually one of the chapters of one of my book, in chapter 2, I talk about this incident a little bit, where Apple put a billboard up at the Consumer Electronics Show in 2019 after the FBI had tried to access the data of the iPhone data of the San Bernardino shooter, that said, "What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas," ultimately suggesting that the company was completely resistant to government efforts to force user data sharing. And so the case of Apple is really informative when we think about how different companies operate in the US and in China relative to the government pressures that they see there, and how that actually shapes their global operations by changing norms. But ultimately, the US-China tech relationship destabilizes not just the US and China, but also all of the companies that trade with both of these countries. The US and China have the biggest tech companies in the world. They have two of the biggest tech markets. And as a result, the European Union, India, Australia, Japan, Korea, all have to negotiate between these two entities and deal with the weaknesses of US technology and Chinese technology, and US tech firms and Chinese tech firms, which is a very difficult position to be in. And in some ways, it's an advantage to be in the US, because at least if the US chooses to regulate, they have, there's market power and there's power to regulate specific companies. The European Union and India don't have those same advantages, for example. So their regulatory process is much more challenging, and it's much more challenging to try to get companies to comply. Though obviously, if it were easy to get US-based companies to comply with regulations and to develop these regulations, we would probably already have them. So I don't want to overstate that. Ultimately, preventing data trafficking is really difficult because of the financial incentives to allow continued surveillance capitalism, because of the industry pressures to ensure the free flow of user data to continue developing new products and services, as well as the geopolitical conflicts that can emerge from creating new boundaries, new digital boundaries, as we saw with the TikTok hearings and the response of the Chinese government. Ultimately, this is a hugely challenging issue. And when I talk about it in the book, I look at a variety of different case studies that in the case of data trafficking. So ranging from social media like TikTok and the Chinese communication app WeChat, Grindr, as I mentioned earlier, from gaming, so games like Fortnite, for example, health, so things like commercial DNA testing and fertility testing, consumer products like the GE consumer appliances, refrigerators that are owned by the Chinese firm Haier and operate on a Baidu backend, which is China's Google, but under the auspices of the GE brand here in the US. So there are a whole range of different areas where we see data trafficking emerging, and there are very few checks that exist to prevent it in the current US regulatory framework. So if you're interested in learning more, I'd urge you to take a look at my book. There should be a link in the chat. And if you want to be able to if you want to read some excerpts or read some op-eds or listen to some podcasts, we also have a Miller Center site that has little bites of information if you want to learn more, but can't quite commit to the book. And there is actually an audiobook version, which I have heard from many people is helpful in a very busy digital age. So I want to thank all of you for your time and attention, and I'm very excited about hearing your questions and hearing more from the UVA community. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Kokas, for that presentation. That's really great. So let's get to some of the questions. We have many, some that have come in during the registration process and some live during this event. So we have an alum that is asking the following question. It's about TikTok. Recently, the federal government banned the use of TikTok on its devices and systems, as well as those of contractors when used to perform work for the government. Is TikTok actually more invasive in terms of data collection than other American-based media applications? And do you think that other platforms will be identified for exclusion from federal systems for similar reasons?
Yeah, so I think WeChat is also excluded. So WeChat is a major communication platform that is the main pathway to communicate with China. So there are a couple of different points here. Is TikTok uniquely exploitative? And I think actually, and this was a point that was made in the TikTok CEO's congressional testimony, it's not that TikTok is uniquely exploitative. And actually, he made the argument, and I think quite compellingly, that because of the scrutiny over TikTok, they're actually a lot more transparent about the user data that they gather. And then other, US-based companies have had to be. Now, that doesn't include the fact that TikTok also has very vague data sharing agreements with its parent company, ByteDance. And ByteDance, as a firm that operates in China, is based in China, whose CEO is located in China, is under uniquely challenging circumstances to share user data under a wide variety of different Chinese laws and policies, including those that I just mentioned, the data security law, the personal information protection law, the provisions for online governance. And one of the big challenges about firms that are subject to significant pressure from the Chinese government is that if you read a lot of these laws and policies, they're extremely vague. I mean, any number of things could constitute a national security violation. And frankly, that metric also moves according to what the current situation is. So talking about the defense minister 2 weeks ago would have probably been fine online. Talking about him this week could be a violation of China's national security if I were to say something very critical about his disappearance, for example. So that's where things get a little tricky. It's not necessarily that firms like TikTok or WeChat are more exploitative in terms of the user data that they gather, though I think a claim could be made to that, but I don't think that's the key point. The key point is the pressure that they face because of their parent companies about the way that they can be forced to share data. Because firms like, and it's not that like Facebook or Instagram or any number of like US-based social media apps wouldn't be totally willing to share data with the Chinese government if they got the chance to operate in China. It's just that they can't operate there. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg asked Xi Jinping to name his first child, just to kind of give you the level of like willingness to compromise and work with the Chinese government. But for security reasons, the Chinese government doesn't allow US social media firms to operate there.
Okay, that's interesting. I had not heard that piece. So we have another question from an alum, and how are you seeing the US government respond to try to protect the data issues of US citizens? You spoke of this a little bit, but if you could expand, and what other organizations are perhaps even better positioned than governments to provide governance or protection for their constituents? And is there perhaps power shifting away from traditional governments?
Yeah. So first of all, we're definitely seeing power shifting away from the government and tech regulation, just because it's the majority of the financial power exists within the tech sector. We're also seeing there's also a lot of movement from the tech sector into government and from the government back into the tech sector. And so as a result, even moves that are made by the US government are also often heavily influenced by the interests of the tech sector because of that kind of revolving door, which incidentally doesn't exist within a Chinese context in the same way. The lines between who makes decisions for the government and who makes decisions for the tech sector are much more separate. So that has an interesting outcome for our policymaking processes. The other thing that's really interesting is in the summer of 2022, we saw that there was this American Data Privacy and Protection Act that had a three corners agreement. So meaning it had agreement from 2 committee chairs in the House and 1 committee chair in the Senate. So it's getting close to moving to maybe a vote. And during the summer of 22, we saw the Dobbs decision come down. And one of the things that was really interesting about the interaction between the Dobbs decision and this broader idea of data security oversight is that what was largely a bipartisan issue then quickly became something mired in like one of the very most partisan issues in a US context. Specifically, the regulation of women's healthcare and how that is tracked via data. And so while for a very long time, there was a huge amount of bipartisan support for moving forward with a lot of these things, because of the different ways that user data is now being deployed, it's actually much more difficult to come to an agreement in Congress. Now, that doesn't make it any less important, but that's one of the reasons why we're seeing a lot of movement on a state level rather than on a national level, because states can move on these issues in ways that the national government can't. However, this is, kind of an interstate commerce issue when it comes down to it. So it really doesn't actually make sense for states to be the leading drivers of decision making here. Now, some things that have been proposed are these kind of either private sector solutions. So basically doing things like making insurance companies liable for hacks or for data sharing that occurs outside of the bounds of terms of service. So that we would basically require insurance companies to enforce these certain laws and policies. Another would be something like Energy Star ratings. So I don't know if any of you have devices at home or consumer products at home that have Energy Star ratings that say, hey, we're only using a certain amount of energy or a certain amount of water. And so one possibility would be kind of industry association driven ratings that would allow parents or other users to know how their data was being used or how it was being exploited or how things, ranked on a different system as they're making consumer decisions. So none of these are perfect options. And that's, in some ways, that's also one of the reasons why I relate it to climate change, because there are very few great options for like solving climate change. And one of the things I talk about in the conclusion of my book is the need for, as we see in a climate context, the need for incremental solutions as much as for like wide-ranging comprehensive decision outcomes, because it's very difficult to do things comprehensively when there's a lot of disagreement.
Interesting. Yeah, I did find that piece with the climate change very interesting, and I will explore that a little bit more myself. We have something coming in, a question coming in from a parent, and this was a common theme of some of the questions. What can we do to protect ourselves and our information and our data? The questioner says it seems like the horse is out of the barn a little bit, and it seems a little bit frightening.
Yeah, and again, I hate to keep going back to this, but this is the way it's also very similar to the climate situation. Like, we're already in a situation where this has gotten out of hand. Like, the time to act really would have been like 10 years ago or 15 years ago. But that being said, we still live in this world, so we can't be like, oh, it would have been great if 15 years ago we would have been smart and done something. So there are a couple of different ways that we can approach this. One is to, talk with your representatives and talk with the people in your community and talk about how this is really something that needs to be a bipartisan issue, and there needs to be bipartisan movement, because otherwise the train will really leave the station, or the horse will really leave the barn after the door is open. I mean, whatever metaphor you want to use, it's only escalating. So the ideal is that we don't look back in 15 years and say, wow, we had a chance to do something then, but we just didn't. So that's one of the reasons why I'm teaching my class, The Data Ethics of TikTok, here at UVA. I testified in Congress in July to talk about the need for kind of systemic reform. But I think one of the big challenges is, much like the climate debate, people are being told, oh, just, use metal straws and eat less meat and drive an electric car, when really it needs to be a kind of systemic overhaul of how we use energy more broadly. And I think shifting the terms of the debate to not just what should individuals be doing, but how do we as a society shift how we engage with technology is crucial.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for that. So we have some questions that have come in, and this is an interesting one. And two people brought up the whole issue of the EU, and as sort of a comparative government question, is anyone analyzing the apparently stark gap between the US and EU regulatory environment, and possibly more important, why?
Yeah, so I have I have a colleague, Johannes Stumpart, in Brussels, who's doing great work on this. And there are a wide range of different scholars who are really doing terrific work on, like, from the EU on the EU. So it's a really interesting dynamic. When talking with, so I often, and when I was initially giving talks about this, would use the EU as an example for what the US could emulate. And I still believe that, there's like, the US is really, or the EU is really ahead in terms of thinking about privacy and AI regulations. And there's a lot that the US can learn from. But then it was very interesting in talking with EU. I gave this talk in Europe, and I used the EU as an example of, a great work that's being done and how the US could learn from it, thinking that I would ingratiate myself with my European colleagues. That's not just why I was saying it, but I was like, oh, this is going to be a winning point here. And man, that was not the response that I got from people who were like, yeah, but look at the US, look at China. You guys actually have companies that can move how decisions are made because you don't have so much bureaucracy. And like, how many big European tech companies do you see? So the only thing that we can do is regulate. We can't actually, dictate how things work because of how our companies are operating. And we have to choose between, the US and China. So it's a very, very complicated system. And whereas before I was like, the US just needs to regulate. I have actually pulled back on that to say that the US needs to identify very narrow, specific ways that we can regulate on, things like cross-border data flows to specific countries or in specific contexts, rather than regulating all cross-border data flows, because there is a really significant power in being the market leader as well, in being able to shape how things happen. So it's really nuanced, and I'm always eager to hear from UVA alums and anyone who has different ideas for this, because I think it needs to be an all hands on deck approach.
Absolutely. Thank you. So this question, this person's an alum, they're a faculty, they're a staff, and they're a parent. So
okay.
How much of the rise to digital supremacy for China can be blamed on spying? And that is spying by them on us, either directly or surreptitiously, or by exploiting information on social media.
Okay, well, a couple of things. I should note that generally Chinese spies don't want to talk to me unless or I mean, maybe they do, but for reasons that are not to tell me what their tradecraft is. So I should be really clear that any knowledge of how Chinese spycraft works is not necessarily something that I would even have a detailed knowledge of, and whatever knowledge of I would have, I could not share at a UVA Lifetime Learning and UVA Office of Engagement event online. That would not be possible. So what I will talk about is some structural things that I think are really important for people in the public to understand. Obviously, there's spying that occurs between the US and China, and if you talk to partners in China, they will point to like a billion different things that the US did and does that are these terrible spying that the US does over China. People in the US will talk about Chinese spying. So let's just for a moment bracket that, acknowledging that it occurs, and the degree to which it occurs on either side, we'll kind of leave that for a different context of conversation. The thing that I think that we do see in a Chinese context, and when we're talking about, for example, the Apple iPhone, Huawei phone debate, is this intense pressure to share IP as a condition for entering and operating within the Chinese market. And sharing is really a very gentle term for extracting in exchange for financial interests in the market. So when we're looking at a lot of these issues, it's US corporations and foreign corporations that have actually amplified the growth of the Chinese tech sector by being willing to make trade-offs to enter the Chinese, willing to make trade-offs of sharing data, of sharing IP, of operating in conditions where there's kind of continuous data theft. And rather than saying, you know what, I'm going to pull back from this market so that I don't share so that I'm not allowing my IP to be, extracted. I'm just willing to take that hit in order to continue to make money here because my competitors are making money here, or because I'm trying to increase shareholder value in the Chinese market as, a really big, important, growing market. And I think that's something that for a very long time was that kind of long-term national competitive implications of moves like that. It's something that was not necessarily internalized as an externality by companies that were operating in the Chinese market. And now, as those companies are seeing kind of local competitors become really significant players, as global markets are seeing local competitors become really significant players, the broader implications of that are becoming much more clear. And the trade-offs that firms were willing to make in order to continue operating in China and continue growing their market share there are much more plain. And we're also in a moment where there are significant questions about what US companies can continue to operate in China, both because of the political risk for them, because of the political risk for their employees, because of the market risk of increasingly robust Chinese government data regulations and other tech regulations. And so it's a tough environment. And as someone who worked in market entry consulting for the Chinese market, for the tech sector in the early 2000s, like I really take this to heart as, some interesting decision making that took place. And I understand the rationale behind it, but it's creating a very complicated set of circumstances that we're dealing with now in 2023.
Interesting. So I think this will be our last question, but this question is, do you foresee America adopting a digital Bill of Rights in the next 10 to 15 years?
No. I think even our existing digital rights are very much under attack, not just our existing digital rights. I mean, I feel like the original Bill of Rights has its own kind of, we've got lots of questions about how that's doing right now in the US. So the fact that we would come together to establish, nationally in a highly partisan environment, a new Bill of Rights that everyone would sign on to, I'm not very bullish on that. But am I hopeful? Do I continue to try to teach my students the importance of understanding what their digital rights are and how they might seek to enact those and advocate for them? Yes. I am a real optimist in that sense, and so I'll continue to fight for it. But if I were betting my farm on it, I would not bet on it. So,
okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Kokas, for all of this information and for sharing your research and your book with us. This is such an important topic for all of us to really understand and consider how we should protect ourselves and our data and advocate for policy changes. So I want to thank you so much for spending time this afternoon with UVA's alumni, friends, and families.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to take a moment and bring an upcoming Lifetime Learning program to your attention. Lifetime Learning is partnering with UVA's Environmental Institute for another virtual event on Wednesday, October 11th, for a program entitled Extreme Weather Events and a Changing Environment. A panel of UVA experts will tackle the scientific causes of some of the latest weather-related crises, the impact on communities, and potential solutions. You can sign up for this program and others at our website at engagement.virginia.edu/learn. So please consider visiting our website to check out other Lifetime Learning programs, the vodcast library, our Thoughts from the Lawn blogs, and our UVA Speaks podcast series to read, watch, and listen to UVA expert faculty. So again, that email address is engagement.virginia.edu/learn. So thank you again for joining us for this hour of learning, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon and evening. Thank you so much.